Anyway, it seems the end goal was to burn down the whole mansion and escape with fake Peppino still inside. Now the reasoning behind its removal was just that it was simply too ambitious of a concept, which is a shame. It does seem like a really cool idea. Now the eggplant and potato fellas later returned as enemies in the stage fun farm, along with the tomato dudes mentioned previously. And obviously fake Peppino himself later returned as the boss of floor 4. Now speaking of bosses, they're an aspect that changed a ton through the course of development. In the final game, the bosses are only able to be damaged after certain attacks or at certain points of vulnerability. But originally, bosses could be damaged constantly, with no cooldown. Now apparently it was changed to the way we know it, because the fights felt a bit too mindless, and that makes sense. Now here's a weird one, the scrapped bee boss. Yeah, so at one point this was the actual boss for floor 4. The fight would begin with a completely empty room, and then suddenly a bee just flies through a window and is revealed to be the boss. Now as you can see, it's very unfinished, but the fight itself basically consisted of standing on this button at the right time, in order to catch the bee in this cloud. Now apparently this was at a point in development where the bosses were much simpler in design, and that seems pretty evident here. But apparently it was cut because it felt more like a stage gimmick than an actual boss. Now in the final game, Mr. Stick is a character that doesn't do all that much, but at one point it was actually intended for him to have his own boss fight. And this one's also quite unfinished, but the fight itself basically consisted of him flying around and summoning each boss one by one. Now not all of them need to be defeated however. As soon as he himself is dealt enough damage, he'd die and the fight would end. Here's an early version of the noise fight that was much simpler compared to the final game. He only had 2 attacks, bouncing around attempting to press Peppino into a pizza, and spawning these noisy enemies, which could then be thrown back, allowing you to damage him. Now this attack he does in the final game kind of resembles this early noise, but other than that, the final version of the fight obviously has a lot more to it. Also in some other early versions of the fight, instead of blowing up to fake you out, he'd dab instead, as seen here. Very epic. Now eventually, after the current version of the fight was fully developed, there was still one aspect that changed. After the fight ended and the key was collected, the noise would actually come along from off screen and steal the key back from you. And after arriving back at the hub, these reporter guys would lead you down each floor, eventually bringing you to the noise himself, revealed to be hiding on floor 1, where you'd steal the key right back. Now apparently this was removed because it was too confusing for playtesters. But that's not all. A later iteration in the idea had the noise hiding in the stage John Gutter after stealing the key, where the stage would then be transformed and permanently renamed to Noise Gutter. No, I'm not kidding. The stage would get a complete makeover, with all Fork Knights being replaced with these noisy enemies, and the song The Noise's jam-packed radical anthem playing instead of the regular music. Now unfortunately this idea was conceived far too close to the release deadline, so it couldn't make it for that reason. Now before we move on, I want to quickly touch on these boss ideas that McPig was throwing around on the Pizza Tower Discord server back in 2020. And keep in mind, this just seems to be him spitballing here, but I still think it's worth discussing regardless. So back when the Cheese Dragon was still the floor 1 boss, the idea was for the floor 2 boss to be Mort in a UFO, making use of the super jump to damage him. An idea for the floor 3 boss was a kind of arena, similar to the ones found in Kirby games, with opponents like a single cheese slime that dies in one hit, the noise in a kung fu getup, and even Gustavo. Here's an idea for boss 4 being a mayor you'd have to win an election against, with Peppino needing to beat up the voters and throw them into his voting booth instead, which is obviously hilarious. But my favourite is this idea for a rhythm game style fight against fake Peppino, with the player needing to jump, grab and taunt in rhythm whilst avoiding projectiles, with the idea that it'd be a kind of reversal of expectations. Alright, now here are some messages from back in 2018 that show that very early on, Pillar John was sort of the main antagonist of the story. He'd comment on your game and taunt Peppino throughout, and in the end he'd reveal his true form, being the tower itself, then transforming into a Rudy the Clown type figure for the final boss fight. Rudy the Clown being this guy from Wario Land 3 if you're not aware. Now at the time, you'd actually feed Pillar John at the end of every stage, so you'd actually be making him stronger throughout the game, without knowing he's the true villain, which is an interesting concept. The idea of a clown as a final boss stuck around however. Alright, so here's a really cool and crazy ambitious concept for the hub world. So after the game's intro, you'd make your way to the tutorial, where you'd presumably super jump up from here, making it to the hub itself. After beating the first stage, you'd actually have a conversation with Gustavo. And here's an example of some dialogue taken from a playtester feedback document, and I'm not going to read this all out loud, but feel free to pause and read this stuff, it's pretty good. There'd even be different dialogue depending on what stages you'd beaten thus far. Real neat stuff. Now it's not just Gustavo you'd be able to speak to, there were NPCs all over the hub that had dialogue, such as this guy telling you to take his bike, or this wizard guy, and yeah, this is obviously placeholder dialogue. Now at some points, these bosses here would block your way, with the player needing to meet them at the Mr. Stick arena in order to fight them and proceed forward. There were even some puzzle elements here too, like this UFO stage that only appeared after waiting in a specific spot for it to become night, something that this NPC here apparently clued you in on. There's also this cheese boat here you'd acquire at some point, which would allow you to sail to this island, where Pepperman appears to be stranded. Now the temporary sprite of this boat is still in the files as seen here. While this whole hub concept is really neat and all, I feel the simplicity of the Final Games hub is preferable overall, at least to me personally. Some remnants of this old hub still make it to the final design however. The Noisette Cafe and laundry room are still present in this floor 4 secret room and this floor 5 secret room mentioned previously. Alright, before we get into final boss stuff, let's touch on sound effects real quick. Here are some early Peppino voice lines, where he has a much higher pitched tone of voice. Yahoo! Yay! There were also these cut voice lines for the TV.
That's pretty good!
Oh man!
Is that also meant to be Peppino? But now these are my favourite, the early enemy screams. Alrighty, let's get into final boss stuff. So in the final game, Pizza Face only has 2 attacks, spawning enemies, and this slam move. But in this early concept art, you can see it was originally intended for it to have a whole bunch of different attacks, including a mustache whip attack, a swear bubble attack, some sort of nose attack, and this pepperoni crying attack. Now as the fight progressed, parts of his face would detach, with Peppino needing to pick them up and toss them back in order to deal damage. His face would also become gradually more skeletal as more parts came off. And he does actually make a similar face to this when the fight first starts in the final game. And honestly, this early version of the fight seems way cooler to me, but I guess it was decided to simplify it for whatever reason. Now the Pizza Head fight was also quite different at first. Here's some very early footage of the fight in action, and as you can see, the fight differed quite a bit in terms of attacks, with stuff like this spring head attack, this jousting charge, this long kick, and this one where he threw a big Peppino head, which is probably a remnant of when the HUD still displayed Peppino's disembodied head in the top left. Oh yeah, there are also these sprites where he straight up eats a rat whole. Pretty great. Now before the final boss rush concept was decided on, there was an entirely different plan for phase 3 of the fight, shown in this concept video. And here are some sprites of what it looked like in game. But best of all is this concept art that shows a completely nude Peppino at his absolute breaking point. Amazing. Alright, to wrap up, here's some footage of an early version of the final stage. The stage was about twice as long as it is in the final game, with double the time limit. And for the first 5 minutes of the stage, the fake Peppino boss fight music would play, with the second half playing the exit theme heard in the final game. And finally there's this concept art that shows that Pizza Head himself would have originally joined you in the escape parade along with everyone else. And look, the B-Boss is here too. Thanks to everyone who let me use their footage for this video, and thanks again to Cactus Companion for all the help.